Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director of the LSE South Asia Center here at the London School of Economics. I'm very glad to have all of you back this afternoon for this event. And it's the next one in our Fact and Fiction series. For those of you who've been following our events over the last 2.5 years, this is a series in which we focus on a particular volume, a book that is interesting and relevant for South Asia, and then we have a discussion that surrounds that book, engaging with the book from multiple perspectives. It's a huge pleasure, especially this afternoon, because the book that we have chosen, one of the co-editors of it is David Lewis, who is a colleague of ours here at the London School of Economics, and I will introduce all our speakers shortly. The volume itself is titled New Mediums, Better Messages, How Innovations in Translation, Engagement, and Advocacy Are Changing International Development. Here's the book. I'm very happy to show it to all of you. I should mention here that David is one of 3 editors, the other editors being Dennis Rodgers and Michael Woolcock. I've just tweeted the event and the link to the book, as well as we've pasted the link in the chat box. So you can now download the book from there. The book was published by Oxford University Press last year. It is available through open access, so it's perfectly legal to download that book and have a go at it. It's really, really very interesting, as I hope you will discover. I'll speak very briefly about why we chose to focus on this book in due course. But before that, could I please say a very big and very warm welcome to all our members of the audience who've joined us actually quite literally from different parts of the globe and across various time zones. It's always very encouraging for us to see the kind of interest that so many of you have in the events that we do, because it is, yes, a very convenient middle of the afternoon, 3:30 for me, but it is not for several others. I know that too. The event is happening via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube, as all of you can see. Information about the speakers is available in the description of the event just below your screen on YouTube, as are their Twitter handles. The chat function in YouTube is enabled for all of you to ask questions. Please do ask questions, because we would very much like to hear what you have to say of our discussion. You're welcome to ask questions to an individual panelist, or you are equally welcome to pose a question to the entire panel. I will read out the question on your behalf, and the speakers and the panelists will no doubt answer them. I should add here, for the benefit of any of you who is a new member of the audience and may not have attended either an on-site event at LSE or one of our online events earlier, that had this event been on-site at LSE, members of the audience at LSE have the right to ask questions in public events without revealing their identity and remaining anonymous. So in keeping as close to that spirit as possible, I will pose the questions asked by members of the audience, but I won't be announcing their names, though I know that for several of you, the names are probably going to be visible on the YouTube chat box. But nonetheless, I will ask the questions without mentioning the names. So why did we choose this volume for the discussion this afternoon? Let me begin with saying that it is not my place to say too much about this, because that is the reason why we have such an erudite panel today, a very interesting and a very carefully chosen one. With each of the panelists, I've been engaging over the last several months about doing this book. Each of the panelists has also very kindly made the time to read the volume, and they will no doubt talk about the various things that have been of interest to them while reading this volume. But I did think that it would be useful for me as the chair and the moderator and as the person who puts these events together for the South Asia Center to say why we in the first place thought that this would be a very interesting volume to discuss for South Asia. The volume, for those of you who may not have seen it as yet, is a collection of articles and essays. They deal with a variety of topics: music, songs, radio, theater, photography, trash and dump sites, writers, journalists, bloggers, sports, art festivals. There's a variety of things. All these are in the context and in the wider context of studying what we call international development or development studies, and that is how it also appears in the title of the book. Now, as the contents of the volume, as I just read out, illustrate, the volume actually draws attention to how all these issues and all these subjects of study can be seen as sources, or for those of us who are slightly older, we use the word archives, which is a word that is making a return, thankfully, but sources or archives to study what we otherwise tend to treat as mainstream social science disciplines, whether it be international development or history or politics or economics and so on and so forth. Now, very importantly, I should clarify that when I say mainstream social science disciplines, I am in no way suggesting that those who study music and food and culinary studies and radio, etc., they're not mainstream disciplines. There is a huge amount of academic literature, research-based literature in these academic parishes as well. However, as all of us know, whichever discipline we are studying, there has been, even within interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, there has been a paucity, a lack of a cross-pollination of what has largely functioned under the umbrella of cultural studies and those of the other disciplines, the older disciplines. So what I'm actually trying to do in this event is to open up the contents of this volume. Actually, not very many of them have to do with South Asia, but it's the manner in which these subjects and sources have been used and the arguments they make about how these can be used to understand and study international development in this instance, and therefore hope and see by application how we can expand the source and archival base of all our disciplinary and subject studies in the case of South Asia, given that all of us are constantly looking for new sources. We are wanting to tell more nuanced stories, more complete stories, more fuller stories, more grounded stories. So even those like me who study 14th century history. So that's the reason why we thought that this volume would be very, very interesting to help us explore as well as open up conversations about how many more sources we could possibly have and how meaningfully they can be and how organically they can be woven into whatever it is that we are studying, that sources don't always have to be geometric, they don't have to be big data and numbers, and yet can be very, very useful. Our panel today will discuss all this, I'm sure, and much more, both from the perspective of being practitioners as well as scholars of these fields of study. And it is my enormous pleasure now to introduce all of them. We've had a brief chat before we went live about how we were going to conduct this event. And what we've decided is that I'll invite David to introduce the book. First, David will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And after that, we will have each panelist, first Vinod Pavarala, then Sarah Sadler, to give their initial comments about the book. And then Krishnendu will carry forward the event with acting as discussant, which includes his giving his own views, and we can take it from there. And once again, an invitation to all members of the audience, please do feel free to ask questions. David Lewis is Professor of Anthropology and Development at the London School of Economics and co-editor, along with Dennis Rodgers and Michael Woolcock, of New Mediums, Better Messages, How Innovations in Translation, Engagement and Advocacy Are Changing International Development, around which this roundtable is organized. I should mention here, and before I go on to introduce the others, that the publications that I mention are only those that are relevant to today's events. All the people you see in front of you on the screen have other publications as well. Dr. Sarah Sadler is Assistant Professor of Theatre at Baruch College at the City University of New York in New York. Sarah's current book project is titled Performing Corporate Bodies, Multinational Theatre in Global India. which is an ethnography of theatre-based workplace training in corporate India. And Sarah will speak after David speaks. Vinod Pavarala is Senior Professor of Communication and UNESCO Chair on Community Media at the University of Hyderabad in India, and co-author with Kanchan Malik of Other Voices, The Struggle for Community Radio in India. Finally, Krishnendu Ray is Professor of Food Studies at NYU Steinhardt, New York, and author most recently of The Ethnic Restaurateur. I've been trying to practice saying this word so that I don't trip over it, which was published in 2016. I'm now going to invite David to make his opening remarks and to introduce the book. David, please speak now. You have about 10 to 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Nilanjan, and welcome everybody to this discussion panel. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about the book and to talk about these issues that have become a kind of passion of mine as somebody with a background in social sciences and anthropology in particular. Thinking about these issues have started to preoccupy me as much as my mainstream work. So it's moved from being a hobby into something that I'm increasingly interested in academically. So the origins of this book lie in what we, me and the co-editors, fondly call our PROD project, Popular Representations of Development. And this really began as conversations over coffee about 15 years ago, where we started to talk about the novels that we were reading, all of us being interested in development and teaching development and doing research around development issues. Reading this, talking about the novels that we'd been reading and how some of these issues were represented in those novels. Rohinton Mystery's Fine Balance, for example, which was a very popular novel about the emergency period in 1970s India that dealt with household livelihoods and struggles with the state. So we became very interested in this whole topic of the arts and humanities as an overlooked and perhaps underappreciated source of what we thought was legitimate knowledge about development, knowledge to be placed alongside the kind of academic texts and policy reports that we were concerned with reading in our day-to-day research and teaching. When we talked about development, we were talking about this in a very loose, inclusive way, from geopolitics to individual and household level poverty and disadvantage issues. So development in all of its broad interpretations. And we became very interested in the power of the arts, whether we were talking about novels, which is where we started. We then moved on to film. We also moved on to music. And we started to, I suppose, improvise papers around these issues, trying to open them up for a development studies audience. And we became interested in the power of the arts to reflect, to communicate, and to influence wider issues and representations. So that was one of the preoccupations. The second one was to locate this discussion in what we saw and continue to see as the narrowing of what is considered legitimate knowledge within our subject area. So within development studies, which is the broad interdisciplinary field of social science that we all work in, there's a kind of narrowing of what is considered legitimate knowledge. It's not only academic knowledge produced through academic activities and endeavors, but we saw it as an increasingly quantitative, economics-led view of the world that was, even within the social sciences, becoming monocultural and less diverse. And even within the quantitative economics frame, the rise of methodologies like randomized control trials was starting to dominate the field of representations, and was, becoming the center of what was considered legitimate knowledge. In fact, RCTs were at that time becoming regarded by some people as the gold standard in, how one could understand the world, produce legitimate information. So that was the second theme. Third theme was this idea that another reason to study popular culture in relation to development was the idea that this was how much of the world understands and accesses information on these kinds of issues. And we were mindful here of James Scott's distinction between the vernacular and official orders, the idea that there is knowledge produced from lived experience and there is official or abstract knowledge, and that we have to understand both of these and understand them side by side. So we went on to produce an earlier book where we started to find like-minded people who were interested in these themes. And this new book is the result of our most recent endeavors. And we've put together 12 chapters covering a range of issues and different authors, organized around 3 themes: translation, engagement, and advocacy. And the first theme of translation is about how do popular representations challenge scientific ones. And we've organized a number of chapters under that theme. I guess one of the ones that would be most of interest to South Asian readers would be our chapter on music. For example, we talk about how in Bangladesh, which is my main area of fieldwork, popular Sufi Baul music has become the focus of a whole range of political contestations that reflect secular and religious identities in the state of Bangladesh. That's one of the themes we talk about. Another of the chapters there, the one by Hilary Standing, is an interesting chapter that narrates the transition of an academic into the role of novelist, where she writes about some of her experiences in the world of development studies in the context of a novel, which is also set in Bangladesh. The second set of chapters is around advocacy. And here we talk about Duncan Green's experience with the development blog. And, perhaps for South Asian readers, Emily LaRue Rutledge's chapter on radio would be of particular interest, where she talks about narratives of gender and development in a BBC series on the World Service. And then finally, the final section is around engagement. How do popular representations allow the articulation of alternative views? And here, there's a chapter focused on South Asian issues by Shapa Salim called Ala Megde, which is about culture and climate struggles in Bangladesh. So there's 12 chapters. I would love to get people's feedback on that work. We've had a lot of enjoyable hours putting it together. Where do we end up in the book? What's our conclusion? Why have we done this? Well, we're making an argument, I think, essentially for a more pluralistic, more sophisticated epistemologies, more diverse perspectives, and in the context of wider debates about the decolonization of knowledge, we're also interested in questions of the democratization of knowledge. We think that there should be a much broader acceptance of different types of ways of thinking, ways of seeing about the world. So this is essentially a project around pluralism. We're also interested in critiquing the narrowness of what is considered to be acceptable knowledge for academic work, for policy making. There's no escape from the cliche that we mentioned in our introduction. We campaign in poetry and we govern in prose. The idea being that actually we need both. And if science works by simplifying complexities, that's one of the necessary compromises that economics makes when it models, or other sciences model the world by simplifying it. That's a legitimate thing to do. But good art is expansive. It engages with complexity. It accepts ambiguity. And all of those things we think are really important to hold in place together. And so we're asking, can we achieve the best of both worlds? We need to both try to simplify if we're trying to understand the world, but we also need to expand and make complex a range of different positionalities, of types of information, of forms of representation. So that's really what the book is all about. And I look forward very much to people's impressions, questions, and further thoughts on the topic. And I think I managed to keep to time by some miracle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was absolutely wonderful. And for all of us on this panel who I know have read the book, this was such a good summary for those who may not have had the chance as yet to have accessed the book. And I do hope that people will download it from the link that we've circulated both on Twitter as well as in the YouTube's chat box. Thank you also for mentioning the word popular. I was very careful in my introduction to not use that word. I said cultural studies, but I didn't say popular, especially because coming as I do from the discipline of history, the use of the word popular often denotes a variety of other things. But we will come to that, because one of the questions that I have for you, and I'd love to hear what the others also have to say, is the whole question of how these things constantly keep getting reworked at the non-elite level. These things, as in my case, history, and what Shahid Amin somewhere calls the quotidian. But anyway, I'm now going to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Sarah Sadler is Assistant Professor of Theatre at Baruch College at the City University of New York in New York. And Sarah's current book project is titled Performing Corporate Bodies, Multinational Theatre in Global India, which is an ethnography of theatre-based workplace training in corporate India. Sarah, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I just first want to say thanks so much for inviting me to join this discussion on what I found to be such an engaging and timely book. So I guess I'll start by saying that I encountered this book not as a development scholar per se, but as a theater and performance studies scholar who for a really long time has been interested in the ways that embodied and aesthetic forms of knowledge really hold the potential to texture and disrupt dominant institutional narratives, right? So for me, this volume really does an excellent job at demonstrating the importance of the arts and humanities as these critical forms of knowledge creation in today's world by doing, as you talked about, David, this deep dive into how these forms like music and games, which is fascinating, to festivals and popular theater, represent and portray, as well as demystify or disrupt these narratives around development. So I'll just briefly highlight a few threads and broad questions the volume raised for me, while also speaking through my own research. The first thread that really spoke to me is the volume's overall mission to parse the role of the humanities as this useful alternative to these economic languages of value and return. And my own research is tracking how global management theory and practice has been increasingly embracing artistic forms as this shift away from scientific rationalist paradigms of managing that have dominated business discourse for decades. So as part of this global so-called aesthetic turn in management theory, you see these business institutions around the world turning to performing arts genres to, revive the humanistic dimensions of work. And I think this serves as perhaps an interesting counterpoint or something to texture this narrowing of development discourse that you're calling attention to, which I think is really interesting to think about. And I've been really interested in the use of theater-based management training in contemporary urban India, where dramatic forms like Indian street theater, folk drama, theater of the oppressed, and so on, are deployed by institutions as a legitimate management training tool in the multinational corporate sector. And in my own ethnographic work of this trend, I'm interested in sort of the micro level ways in which institutions are wielding these artistic languages and figures and techniques to produce these unique avenues of expression and disobedience and reflection in these highly surveilled workplace contexts. And in the vein of lots of the essays in this volume, I've seen very powerfully how the deployment of artistic forms in a nation like India, which has so many rich and varied complex histories of performance, produces a range of behaviors and ideas and feelings that really cannot be reduced to these economic languages of investment and human capital and so on. And so it's all to say that I think the book's methodological intervention is a really important one. And I think it demonstrates or contributes to the ways that we're seeing this broader global shift in how the critical humanities are being instrumentalized in institutional discourse, which I think is only going to continue to grow as the business world, the world in general, continues to face these continual moments of crisis and disillusionment. And this really brings me to my second point, which is about the book's emphasis on thinking through the politics of engaging with humanities mediums as representations of development. In my own research, I've seen how applied theater for corporate development, for example, first can operate as this really transformative vessel for individual validation and cultural vocation and change, right? But on the other hand, I've also been through and seen ways that these same deployments of the arts can be used as a form of cultural conditioning. And in my own work, I'm interested in how for example, this case of theater in the workplace might intensify these gendered or nationalist or caste and class dimensions of the corporate world, and sometimes work to intensify exploitation in the service of corporate capital, right? So I think it's important. I was thinking a lot about how to parse these thorny representational politics of thinking about the humanities as a methodology, in particular, its dual potential to empower, right? But also oppress, right? And I think the essays did a great job at teasing out these complex ideas, the trash photography, the development games, and so on. So some questions that came up for me is, as we work to translate and engage and advocate for the efficacy of the humanities, how can our research also attend to the ways these very same forms, right, are and can be wielded for anti-democratic, anti-radical change, right, anti-community-based change? To what extent, as critiques of the creative economy have also discussed, are we seeing a recoding of the critical humanities or a re-quantification of the critical humanities in the service of these institutional branding or profit in some way? And I think teasing out that thorny dynamic is really was really great to see. And then I guess I'll just say that as a last point, I was also broadly thinking through the book's emphasis on representation, or thinking about the humanities as representation, you know, notwithstanding the importance of, you know, representation as a critical tool of analysis. I also think a lot about the ways that the arts and humanities are these really unique forms of knowledge production and creation that sort of force us to grapple with, you know, the fleshy materiality of the body, right? Phenomenological registers of affect and power, right? That are hidden or implicit, right? So to what extent, you know, and this is just a question that I wonder about a lot, to what extent does materiality get lost, continues to fight to assert its place in discourse, right? You know, for me, it's precisely that materiality that matters, the microdynamics of how these forms are actually administrated in practice, that provokes the productive as well as the deeply ambiguous, right? Word that, to use your own word, discoveries. So that how to attend to, I guess, the urgency of materiality in a way that allows, you know, research, in a way that allows us to both work within as well as disrupt these dominant narratives, seems to be an especially important project this book asserts and has me continuing to think about. So yeah, those are a few of my thoughts, and thank you for the opportunity to engage with this fantastic read.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was absolutely great. And I'm sure we will come back to all of these. And I'm sure David will be given a chance to respond to the various points that you made. Before I introduce the next speaker, I did want to say, for the benefit of those who were listening, as well as for all of you, that what I was quoting from Shahid Amin was the actual words are to figure out the relationship between the evidence of the archive and the language of history, that is the people, and what he has more recently referred to as the quotidian reshaping the historic. That was what I was referring to. Our next speaker is Vinod Pavarala, who is Senior Professor of Communication and UNESCO Chair on Community Media at the University of Hyderabad in India, and is co-author with Kanchan and Malik of Other Voices, The Struggle for Community Radio in India. Professor Pavarala's, we've had some exchanges recently over email, and you know, there's a lot of work he's done. I've only quoted the one book that was published in 2007, but I'm sure he will come to it from the perspective of radio, and especially local and community radio. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say. Professor Pavarala, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel discussion. I've read quite a few chapters of the book and browsed through most of it. And congratulations, David, to you and your co-authors. I'm now really tempted to go to the previous book, the Popular Representations volume, and I'm looking forward to reading that. I mean, this work, like Sarah Sadler mentioned, not only makes an important methodological intervention, but also helps expand the field of development studies to include possible legitimate contributions by the arts and humanities. I mean, that goes without saying. In terms of my own location, I am a communication specialist working in the development and social change domain. And I'm going to be framing my remarks from that disciplinary perspective. I have recently written about the concept of intangible outcomes of social change and social change communication. And I want to hang my remarks around this idea of intangibility in social change domain. And I did it because I was somewhat vexed with the quantitative evaluation frameworks that so dominate the international development field. I mean, the idea of intangible outcomes first occurred to us during our fieldwork on the struggle for community radio in India in the early 2000s. And some of the interior rural areas of eastern, western, southern India, we repeatedly encountered the consequences of community radio being talked about by people at the grassroots in terms that defied easy measurement. So they would talk about how it helped foster identity, nurtured local language and culture, built capacities for self-expression, forged community solidarity, and so on. During a recent field visit to rural West Bengal to study the role of theatre of the oppressed in addressing issues of gender discrimination, one woman told our team, "We have now tasted freedom, and we are not going to allow our menfolk to lock us up in our homes anymore." Yeah, I would say go measure that. What kind of quantitative measurement are you going to come up with, right? So the gender empowerment implicit in the statement is clearly something that eludes easy measurement, although it may in the long term have some tangible effects. And there's a lot of interesting critiques of quantification. David mentioned some of it in his opening remarks. If you look at Sarah Engel-Mary's volume on the seductions of quantification, she offers a scathing critique of the imperative for quantitative data, suggesting that there is a clear epistemological bias towards positivistic, so-called evidence-based research. And I argue in some of this work I'm doing that it's partly because of a global governance discourse, with a requirement for accountability. And mostly this is accountability upward to donor agencies, international multilateral organizations, and so on. So the demand for tangible and measurable aspects of development and social change arises out of that regime of power that consists of governments, international donor agencies, multilateral organizations, policymakers, NGOs, and so on. So search then is, I think the authors in David's volume do that very well in capturing some of the intangibles of social change and development without robbing them of their conceptual richness. Perhaps through methods that are quite firmly entrenched in the interpretivist paradigm of social sciences. So the interpretivists emphasize, as you all know, how actors construct meaning intersubjectively and make sense of the world in which they live. Now, in the development and social change sector, this need for capturing the intangible becomes manifest in the context of the human rights-based approaches that have become more conspicuous since the 1990s. If you shift the development work towards a more human rights paradigm, rather than this quantitative econometrics kind of paradigm, there is no way you can avoid demanding that development work emphasize downward accountability to the communities, to popular grassroots, rather than upward accountability. And I think some of the authors in your volume, David, do that quite well. They work on radio, for example, or on theater. I found that quite interesting. And I think the point that David makes about epistemology, about knowledge, I think is very central to this debate. You look at scholars like the Portuguese sociologist Sousa Santos talking about epistemologists of the South. Santos argues against hegemonic epistemologies and speaks in favor of a plurality of knowledges, suggesting that social justice cannot be delivered without cognitive justice. And social emancipation lies in according adequate value to these multiple knowledges. And in that sense, I find this work not only making an important epistemological move in the discourse of international development, but I think it is also a political move, of wanting to privilege marginalized knowledges, of wanting to privilege those whose voices have not been heard enough, right? So some of our work involved looking at theater of the oppressed in rural West Bengal, this organization that's been doing this work for the last 30 years. And you go and talk to people. I mean, they're not talking about development. They're not talking about social change. They're talking about theater as a rehearsal for the revolution. I mean, this is a very different kind of articulation of development. I mean, they want to improve their lives, but they are not merely talking about it in terms of quantitative indices and so on, right? So I'm grateful to the authors in this volume for highlighting some of the different ways in which we could capture the intangible, the way in which we could capture marginalized voices. And I think it is also important, if I can just end with this point, the idea of voice is quite important to my work, that there are other voices that need to play a role in the development discourse. But it is also equally important to talk about the value of listening and the analytical attention we need to pay to what we might call institutional listening. To that, even if one were to so-called give a voice to the marginalized, are we listening? Are institutions listening to them? So concepts of receptivity, recognition, response to those voices become very central. I mean, if all that we are interested in is only to recognize and measure predetermined, tangible aspects of social change, then there is no methodological imperative to listen to other voices that could potentially offer insights to intangible transformations. So I would like to suggest that failure to account for the intangible arises not only out of political indifference to democratic participation and social justice, but also epistemological disregard for marginalized knowledges. Right? To some extent, I feel some of the articles in the volume take us towards that direction of listening to these submerged voices, making sure that you make the point about how institutions need to listen to these voices. And many of these voices coming out of practices that come from the arts and humanities rather than from the social sciences. So let me just stop there and see if we can pick up on some of these things during discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And once again, David, I'm sure you will have a chance to respond to some of them. But between Sarah and Vinod, you've had both the methodological as well as the epistemological. And it'll be very interesting to hear what you have to say. I'm now going to invite Krishnendu Ray, who has very kindly agreed to be discussant for this afternoon's event. Krishnendu is Professor of Food Studies at NYU Steinhardt in New York and is the author most recently of The Ethnic Restaurateur, which was published in 2016. Krishnendu has the privilege of being able to give both his views as well as then starting the discussion. So Krishnendu, the floor is yours now.
Thanks a lot, Nilanjan, and Sarah and Vinod. They have done a terrific job of articulating a lot of the strengths of this book. And in fact, I must start by saying I was a little surprised when Nilanjan invited me, because I'm not a development expert. I work in the idiom of popular culture. Then as I read the book, I realized the mischief he was up to. It's a really compelling book that draws in some of the points raised by the other speakers, and I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes and end with a few questions or one related question for David, and then it can go around for the panel. So for me, the book raises really deeply engaging questions about everyday experience and expert knowledge. And I think, in a sense, the central challenge for us is the bifurcation between the two, both in the domain of science and in the social science. And how to incorporate that back in for a democratic process of development. And each of these chapters, and maybe we'll get a chance of talking about the specific chapters. For instance, the chapter on photography. What is the best way for affective impact? Is it a kind of documentary realism, like a Jacob Riis kind of a piece, or a more complex postmodern representations of cyborgs and demons born out of the ruins of capitalism? And it doesn't easily answer the question. It poses some terrific questions about it. And I think Hilary Standing's chapter on a novel on the arsenic crisis in Bangladesh, which comes out of a very promising intervention which turns toxic, and who's accountable? How do we go about intervening in the world in which even the experts know less than they pretend to do? And so some of those absolutely fascinating questions. And I think Vinod raised the crucial question of the art of listening, and that the humanities and what can be called the soft social sciences really bring a rich, especially in ethnographic work, which is probably most crucially the art of listening and then representing, and this relationship between the insider and outsider. And in a complex ecology, of course, of intergovernmental organizations, state organs, and civil society groups that we see in many of these chapters, for-profit and not-for-profit group. And of course, the title of the book, New Mediums, Better Messages, ? Gestures towards Marshall McLuhan's prophetic vision of the future of mediation and mediatization, and both the promise and the challenges to democracies. And David, here I'll slowly turn towards you. You pointed to James Scott's work on the vernacular and official knowledge, and the importance in terms of popular participation, conception, intervention, and kind of a deepening democratization. And this book and the whole project of PROD, by the way, that's a terrific acronym. In South Asia, we like acronyms a lot. And that's a beautiful acronym, is pushing towards a convergence. And our comments so far are doing the same between, I would say, let me put it like this, between fact and fiction in refreshing and stimulating ways. Okay, and here's the challenge I'm facing, and David, to you and to the rest of the panelists. I find the opening of the social sciences to the humanities promising and refreshing. Yet, how do we distinguish between fact, fiction, and rumor? I'm adding a third term here, rumor, because the last has emerged with a specific virulence all across the world, especially in South Asia, okay, which is the use by the rich and the powerful and not so rich and the not so powerful in mobilizing rumor to assault sections of the poor, to assault minorities, and that's in like Turkey, in India, everywhere. So as we open up the world of facts as constituted by the social sciences, to fiction, the affective world, the evocative world, how do we demarcate it from rumor and virulence, which I see is the demonic side of democracy? Okay, in some ways, David, in some ways, some of your experience about it, and some of, by the way, what I like about this book is this very pragmatic proximity of wrestling things down, and you must have already faced some of those challenges of distinguishing between fact, fiction, and rumor, and its mobilization, not only for inclusive development, but for excluding some people from developmental initiatives. So one is that question, and related secondly to the other question that both Sarah and Vinod raised is the epistemic promise of this opening up. It leads to us to reflect on questions of authoring, authorizing, authenticating, and especially the rules of consecration of forms of knowledge, and also, by the way, rules of refutation of knowledge within each of these domains, right? How do we disprove something, or how do we disagree with something, is also rule bound within these kind of epistemic universes, in spite of what Vinod points to De Sousa Santos's powerful work on epistemologies of the South. The question is, we are also witnessing, for instance, to give you a kind of an example that I wrestle with, mostly as a sociologist who engages with historical sociology, so a lot of historians' work. We are finding history writing now extensive and rampant. A lot of people are writing history who are not historians. Okay, and especially in South Asia, you see that. And for purposes that can be quite insidious, okay, about, for instance, the sui generis idea that Hindus and Indians come sui generis from India and there's no external contact. Okay, that's kind of a persistent argument about this new, I would say, the epistemes of rumor mongering, which is also a form of non-expert intervention in domains of expert knowledge. Okay, so in some ways, the question of democracy and that question of epistemic opening, what I'm pointing to, David, is the demonic dimensions of both those openings. How do you and your colleagues deal with these challenges? And I'll open that up to the rest of the panel too.
David, would you like to speak now?
Wow. Well, how long have I got? I mean, I've had three fantastic sets of comments.
Why don't you start, and then we'll.
Why don't I just take one point maybe from all of my three colleagues? I mean, I think it's hugely, well, as I said before, it's a huge privilege to have people read and comment, and your comments have been very, very generous about the work. I think, from Sarah, I mean, I think, thank you for raising a number of issues, but the one that I think is really interesting to me is your point about the risks of this dualism of the incorporation of the arts and ways of thinking about arts as an alternative to very economistic, managerialist ideas, but at the same time being incorporated into those. I mean, I think that's really interesting, and we've looked at it a little bit in the ways in which music has been commodified and used, and also different forms of arts have been brought into very structured development interventions in ways that I think are also, if not a form of commodification, then a sort of institutionalization and a depoliticizing or a repoliticizing, I suppose. So I think attending to those contradictions, I think that's a great framing, and that's really something that I want to think more about, the co-option of the critical humanities. Vinod, you also made a huge number of interesting points there as well, and I really like your idea of intangible outcomes and how we can start to think about resisting this narrow measurement culture with the challenge of engaging and recognizing the value and importance of these intangible outcomes. You've made me very interested in going to West Bengal now, and sort of talking to some of these theatre people. It really sounds interesting. Theatre as a rehearsal for revolution. You're very excited about that. I think a whole range of really important points there about the the big picture, small picture links as well. So these pressures around global governance and the accountability discourse being linked to ways of thinking about how we value knowledge and how we construct knowledge. So I think really interesting. Krishnendu also, I think, thinking about your challenges around, fact and fiction and rumor. And I think, it's interesting that there are parallel shifts going on, for example, around the crisis in natural science or in formal science, where there's this open science movement now, where there are people saying that scientific knowledge is in crisis and that a new transparency and an opening up of sort of science processes is needed. And, I think it's interesting because the way in which knowledge production has become obscured, politicized, is part of the argument that populist, rumor mongering feeds upon, because when you're creating counter narratives around, say, the safety of vaccines, those people are using easily discreditable pseudoscientific studies as a way of trying to to generate and support alternative narratives. And I think it's the lack of transparency around knowledge production that arguably makes that possible, and that it's only by having not only a more pluralistic landscape of knowledge production, but also a more transparent one in which knowledge can be questioned, can be queried and challenged, and understanding how knowledge production works. I think that idea, your point about the non-expert intervention in expert knowledge is a problem, I think is, there are connections there that we have yet, to make. But I think this idea of a convergence between fact and fiction as well, the Financial Times last weekend has an amazing, it's an unexpectedly amazing arts supplement on African art, in which it's nearly all sort of African authors, artists, comic book writers, and this whole movement of Afrofuturism is a really interesting example of how people are explicitly talking about using art to imagine a future and to construct a future in ways that I think are bringing it into a much more sort of central position within African societies and economies, and the way that they are rejecting external imposed representations, in favor of locally produced ones, but with all the contention and different positionalities within those local knowledge production systems. So look, I haven't done justice to your comments, but you've given me a huge amount to think about there, and I would love to take the discussion forward. So I'll stop there. Okay,
Vinod and Sarah, did either of you want to say anything about the fact fiction rumor and how, well, in search of a better word, these can be distilled and therefore more meaningfully integrated into what goes by the name of academic research?
I think I take Krishnendu's point quite well about that mobilizations could be for both inclusion as well as exclusion. I mean, it alerts us to the possibilities of, it alerts us to not overly romanticizing the popular as a site of legitimate knowledge construction, at all given times. I mean, I think those need to be subjected to the same kind of interrogations that we subject dominant hegemonic knowledge systems as well. So that's a very good point in this discussion. Yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah, I think I'm still thinking through the comments. The idea of repoliticization is really interesting for me to think about. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot about the ideas of expertise and expert authorities and authorization. I think that some of my own work tries to think through the ways that in institutional discourse, the humanities is that you see, creative consultancy and this whole ecosystem seeks to imbue the critical humanities as a regime of expertise, right? Which sort of impacts the ways that these forms and who is doing the work, right? Which kinds of, in the case of in my own research, a lot of it's not artists doing this work. It's consultants who learn particular kinds of theater-based expertise, right? But yeah, the repoliticization that takes place or the recoding is fascinating. So I also plan to think through these ideas. Thanks.
Krishnendu, you're going to speak now, but I just wanted to say something. I was smiling when Krishnendu gave the example of history because, as I was saying earlier, my work is on the 14th century, so I measure time in terms of centuries. And it's for someone like me, if I look at my archives, which are invariably quite literally archives, whether they're textual or they're coins or they're whatever, but I use archive in the tangible sense of the word. I think the point that Vinod made about not over-romanticizing what is happening at the quote-unquote popular or the mass level, and also to subject all that to the same kind of investigative rigor with which we would subject hegemonic forms of knowledge to, which we have all gotten very good at doing now, is that now if you look at it from the historical perspective, what is being discussed as rumor here, 250 years down the line, may well represent itself as being an organic part of popular culture. And there is a challenge in that because the cultural practices that we are talking about here, as well as in the volume, they have all emerged over a long period of time. And there are such examples in history of various places and various countries. I can only speak for India, but that's another very interesting aspect to it because I've my engagement with the volume has been that how would someone who was studying medieval Indian history engage with and try to expand the disciplinary sort of engagement with practices of peoples. And there was a time when some of us had actually put together a module for teaching, which was actually called How Some People Lived, because we will never know how all people lived. So I think that's a very important point that Krishnendu raises about rumor, except that the identity and the status of rumor can change over a long period of time. But Krishnendu, it's your turn.
No, that's a beautiful point. And I think it draws our attention to a related question, which is what is the temporality of that intervention, right? So in some ways, Nilanjan, the example you gave is a terrific one. Over time, we may be able to distinguish between rumor and fact and fiction, right? And what I find this book very attractive about is in attempting to engage with the intervention in the here and now, like the Hilary Standing's example, like the good, clean water. If we could get good, clean water to most people in the world, we would have probably done the most important developmental intervention in the world and kept it separate from waste. We know that, okay? And we do it, and it turns out you, of course, create other problems where 50 to 80 million people may have been poisoned with arsenic as a consequence of an intervention that looked good, promising at one point of time. So here is a question of over time. And here I think is the Vinod's point of listening is crucial. Institutional listening and important feedback loops to basically quickly listening, because that data was emerging, okay, that there's something going on in terms of poisoning. Of course, causation is always very difficult to articulate where you do not have a total controlled randomized controlled trial, right? You have to then formulate it. So this question of timing, and the temporality of these interventions. So I find this book precisely promising because it, in some ways, accounts for, and David, in your conception, okay, there's kind of at least a twofold intervention. One of the challenges here is when you're doing development work in the context of substantial and desperate need, you have to act now with always incomplete and sometimes inadequate knowledge, okay? That someone like Nilanjan has the pleasure of looking back over 400 years and saying, well, what turned out to be what was claimed to be rumor was in fact or fiction, okay? Mobilizing fiction, right? In this temporal constraint of acting now and thinking later, what are some of the examples that you give where this feedback loop of listening becomes a productive way? Because of course, known forms of knowledge, no one's knowledge is going to be foolproof in the long run, okay? And so the question that, could you give some examples of that kind of a feedback loop with quick, rich listening that was productive?
Would you like me to jump in there? I mean, the example that springs to mind for me is one that actually isn't in the book, but which is connected to other work, which is about this movement of what have sometimes been called listening studies. And I think it comes from the medical field, actually, that patients who are experiencing either health conditions or forms of treatment, there's a mode of real-time intervention, and that has spawned some innovative ideas in the development world and in the policy world. There was a huge study undertaken by someone called Mary Anderson called Time to Listen, which was subtitled something like Listening to People on the Receiving End of Aid. And it was a study in a number of different countries. I can't remember all the details, but I was involved with something rather similar in Bangladesh, which was called the Reality Check project. And it took its cue from this listening study idea. And it was precisely this idea of a feedback loop that in the ongoing process of large-scale public sector health reforms over a 5-year plan period, we had small groups of sort of semi-professional citizen ethnographers who would go and spend time with families for a few days every year, and then they'd go back to those families over the 5-year period regularly, and they would simply spend time listening and observing just for 4 or 5 days, building up relationships around how were people experiencing these health reforms. You know, were these sort of shiny community clinics that were being talked about in all of the government and donor brochures actually functioning? Were they even being built? Or if they were, was there anybody useful in them? Were they offering any useful services? And we, over a 5-year period, we tried to build up this listening study idea and create a feedback loop. Now, you know, ironically, well, not ironically, because it would really fit with our conceptual framework of this book. The problem was that when these teams came back to government people and project staff and planners, when they came back with these stories, this, vernacular knowledge, they were met with, well, this is anecdotes, this is not, scientifically constructed knowledge. Why should we pay any attention? So it's a very interesting story of how one can attempt to create these feedback loops, but it's actually, conflicts over what constitutes legitimate knowledge are quite difficult to overcome and to tackle.
Hey, Sarah, can I draw you into this, because you have this rich experience of working with design of these kind of institutions and organizations. Some of your work in that is to how to create kind of both a feedback loop, and I think what, David, you're pointing to is an epistemic disdain that is always institutionalized in forms of authorized forms of knowledge, right? So we have to both create the feedback loop, the capacity to listen, and also kind of an epistemic humility that is very difficult from professors to corporate types to international development types. So Sarah, a little bit, maybe an example of some of the stuff you do to create that loop and create that kind of an epistemic open-mindedness.
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating to hear. I think what's coming clear for me is the one thing that I think is important is how to embrace listening in writing, in the final product, in what becomes legible, in what is able to be seen, heard. And I guess in my own work a lot as a performance studies scholar, the aspects of, for example, theater-based corporate training workshops that I bring attention to are the last thing that a lot of sometimes in the workshops that those who plan and execute and then have to dialogue about these events care about, right? Because they precisely have to be so have to adhere so particularly to deliverables, right? And I think that David talking about the difficulty and the tension of listening and manifesting what you're listening to in writing is so key here, because we see that same sort of silencing of what is being listened to perhaps in our writing, or that wrestling. At the same time, I think it's also really important, speaking to my own work, for example, in working with corporations or with corporate institutions, I hesitate to sound too cynical, I guess, about the work that's happening, because one of the things that I have been interested in is the ways that corporate actors, for example, HR and L&D development departments who commission workshops, for example, they care deeply about what happens in those spaces. They care deeply about not only how they will fulfill their deliverables, but also the space itself, even though what happens in that space never ends up getting translated, if that makes sense. So I think that push and pull is something that I see clearly in my own work, and that demonstrates how, despite my own comments about this easy co-optation of the humanities in my opening remarks, you do see this wrestling and this desire to nevertheless empower in deeply oppressive spaces. But I think it's all to say that regardless of the institutional or academic climate that we're looking at, that the challenges of listening and then translating what you're hearing or whatever is nevertheless still very potent.
Vinod, do you want to kind of reflect a bit from your rich experience about this whole question of institutionalizing listening? And I would also pursue with epistems of the South, for instance, right? And I think the last section, I think it was the introductory chapter of the book that talks about, for instance, decolonizing, right? And important questions of decolonizing. Again, how to cultivate and enrich this project of decolonization, and yet keep it separate from projects of acute nativism. Okay, that we also see entangled in some interesting ways, prolifically in South Asia. So first, this listening question, and then this question of decolonizing and nativism.
Yeah, no, I think by prioritizing the politics and ethics of listening, the idea there is to bring into the field of development studies more robust and critical concepts such as democracy, participation, politics, social justice, issues of equity, and so on. So I think there's a lot of interesting work going on around ethics of listening, and I think it'll be good to bring in that debate into development studies. On the issues of decolonization and epistemology, I'm just thinking of my recent forays into rural West Bengal to look at practices of forum theater, theater of the oppressed. It's fascinating. The emphasis on dialogue, the moving away from a certain kind of development pedagogy that was state-centered, that has been very multilateral, multinational, organization-centric, very top-down. Suddenly, forum theater practices to talk about people's own lives opens up spaces for uncertainty, for ambiguity, for ambivalence, which allows for some room for critical reflection on the part of the people, and not just dumbing down the idea of development and shoving it down their throats. And I think this is very kind of Paulo Freire kind of work, right? Action and reflection, and of course, as I'm sure Sarah and others know, Augusto Boal then takes that idea of Paulo Freire and talks about theater of the oppressed, and it's fascinating. It breaks down the distinction between actors and spectators. Spectators come on and take on roles where they are critically reflecting on their own conditions. I think this is the kind of decolonizing practice I see, with great potential in some of the artistic forms coming out of Latin America, more broadly the global South. And I'll stop there.
Okay.
Perfect. Nilanjan, how are you doing with time?
I'm conscious of time, and we should be ending in at most in about 10 minutes from now. But there was just a couple of things I want to say and get the reaction and response from all of you. But one of the things I did want to say about what Krishnendu said is that, when the reason I made the whole point about time and census of time is that 400 years down the line, you could actually have what is rumored today codified as quote unquote fact. Yeah. So that in itself would, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that one of the things that would be very interesting to study about history and what is not happening in the example that Krishnendu rightly gave is that what are the sources of the sources that we are using? That's a very interesting. And the farther you go, and you can do it even by just reading a catalog of coins through the ages in what is now India, but the subcontinent, as it were. But anyway, the one point I would be very keen for all of you to respond to, Krishnendu, you too, is that why is there, and this is something I have written to all of you about when we were discussing this event, is that why is it that despite all that we have, and we've never had this kind of intellectual ferment earlier, including from relatively extreme or far off positions. Are we not using all the sources or as much of the sources as is relevant to our study? In other words, what I'm asking in very crass terms is there intellectual and disciplinary gatekeeping on all sides? Is that so? But I'm going to begin with a question specifically for David, and this is because I've read both the books. This is a successor volume, as David said. There is an earlier volume which is equally interesting to read. Is that when you were now that you have 2 volumes in place, and the successor volume, came about because there was so much of positive discussion by the first volume, did you at any point feel that it was relatively difficult to find people, academic scholars or non-academics, doesn't have to be academics all the time, write about these sorts of subjects in the context of South Asia?
Well, I think, one thing I would say about this prod venture is that it's countercultural in the sense that there's never been any funding involved. It's not a research project in the modern sense of the word, and I think that's why we're so enthusiastic about it. We're trying to create a model of research that perhaps goes beyond all the constraints that anyone working in a neoliberal university in 2023 has to face. So this is a project that has depended on people's goodwill and people's intellectual interest and people's personal excitement, really, about the fact that there is an agenda here that we think is worth exploring. And so, to answer your question, Neil and John, I mean, we haven't explicitly focused the work on South Asia at all, but I think we've never found it very difficult for either of these volumes to find people who either approach us or who we think have an interesting story to tell in them. And in some cases with people who were unfamiliar with or unconnected to the academic writing conventions. Someone like Mark Bowman, who wrote that chapter about, who's a playwright. I mean, it took a lot of hand-holding and reassurance to persuade people to try and put their ideas into a form that would fit into an academic book. But I think there are many. There's still many unexplored avenues, and I think the more that we do this, the more we find ourselves being drawn into conversations with potential contributors, with people, to say about this. So, so the answer is no. I think in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa as well, I think there's more, there's interest in this, and we have no idea really whether we're going to keep working on this. I think we probably are, but what form it should take. I mean, one thing that going back to an earlier point, at the same time as I think it's right to show how siloed and narrowed a lot of these trends are, there are also some quite encouraging signs. I mean, there is, for example, a new field of climate humanities. There are journals on this, and thinking of Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, where he's commenting on the limitations of the Western individualized novel to engage with the collective or with nature and the natural as opposed to the human. There are people responding to that call, and there are people who are recognizing that some sort of humanities engagement is needed. The same in health. There's also this field of health humanities where people recognize that the subjective conditions of health and well-being can only really be explored by engaging with non-scientific or non-natural science forms of knowledge. So, I think there are some quite interesting trends, although I suspect that some of these trends are also tied into the sorts of co-option, commodification processes that, Sarah, you've talked to us about in connection with theatre and management. There are publishing companies behind some of these new journals, and there are doubtless funding regimes that are underpinning some of these developments too.
Or that as things move forward, even in these new areas, there will be a certain kind of, ossification of acceptances of what is, and I was going to start with asking Krishnendu, and we are running out of time, is that, you are Professor of Food Studies. That's your official title. But what I was thinking was, if you were to take on board, let's say, history, since you made a point about history, but it could be politics, you described yourself as a sociologist. I could, describe you as a political scientist of one time. But the thing is, do you imagine a situation, and this ties up with what Vinod was saying about institutions listening, is, do you think that at some point, if you went too far out into the history, politics, sociology domains, that someone from food studies might say to you, yeah, this is really very interesting, but this is really not food studies?
Yeah, and in fact, I'm going to respond to that, which is, and it links to your earlier question. We see it, and food studies itself is a interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary space, and people would argue which one it is and which one is better. And I think there's a twofold challenge here, and this links to your earlier question. I think there's a lot of the way data is collected. That's why all of us inevitably end up being versions of methodological nationalists, because so much data is produced by the nation state for governmentality, right? We know that. And because of that, for instance, and I'll give you one example, I'm trying to study, in fact, the connective tissue, and that's a tradition in history now, say between the east coast of Africa and the west coast of India. It's like a rich, we know the textiles as a commodities and the rich food history. And I'm just looking at, for instance, how coconuts are sliced open, body techniques and tools and technologies, and you see such connections and also such differences, right? So I think there's a twofold relationship here between boundary work of nation and discipline. So I think transnationalism and methodological kind of multidisciplinarity is very useful, productive, but the other side, one has to be aware of again, the humility of the argument we are already making is it always comes with the danger of an epistemic shallowness, right? And I read, to do my sociological work on, say, slicing open coconuts in Zanzibar and, say, in Kerala, right? I did 2.5 years of reading on the Indian Ocean world, because that world has just exploded, okay? So I'm still uncertain if I have mastered the historical literature as a sociologist to write a historical sociological argument about it. So yes, boundaries, especially of nations and disciplines, are produce knowledge and limit their reach. Breaking those boundaries is not the easiest thing, because you come with like a kind of an epistemic helter-skelterness that also is dubious. Hence, these challenges have complicated answers. Working hard, working a lot, with humility towards your own epistemes and other people's epistemes.
Okay, that was I'm going to make everyone very happy answer, but still useful and a very articulate one. Sarah, you're assistant professor of theatre, and this is a question, it rides on the earlier question and also rides on what Krishnendra just said, is both for you as well as for Vinod. You know, when I was listening to this whole thing of the art of listening and listening, you know, we don't come to the act of listening from a blank space. We are not innocent listeners. Right? So yes, we need to ask to be listened to, or we need to learn how to listen. But even our listening is not innocent. I can say that about textual studies. You know, I go into libraries and archives and I pull out volumes and manuscripts and I read them. That's what I do. But when I read them, invariably, I go to the text with some questions in mind. And there's a body of literature that argues against it by saying you must let this text speak to you rather than go to the text with a set of questions for which you're either seeking answers or, if not answers, at least information. Yeah. What I wanted to ask you was this whole question of disciplinary gatekeeping and whether, you know, as assistant professor of theatre, and in a city like New York, you know, do you think that if you were to spread laterally, disciplinarily, or in terms of your research activities into areas that are more formalized disciplines, you would encounter gatekeeping, or do you feel like a free soul?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yes, of course, right? Like the siloing, I think, especially in terms of something, you know, as someone who came up, got my PhD in theater and performance, and then subsequently got into transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary ecosystems, I think you absolutely still see a deprivileging of performance studies, for example, or a deprivileging of the body, right, in terms of writing. But I don't know. I mean, I think this question returns me to this curious dilemma that this book brought up for me, where as international development discourse is embracing this narrowing, shall we say, we see other forms of institutional discourse in my own work on critical management studies, organizational studies, embracing the human, right? This huge humanistic turn, which is very interdisciplinary, right? I mean, theater of the oppressed, and this is I'm busy writing this chapter now, but Augusto Boal has become a management figure, right? There's a whole niche realm of organizational studies discourse that is devoted to not only like co-opting, I don't think it's very complex, right? And to do this really intentional, for lack of a better word, listening, right? As well as the Krishnendu said a great term, this epistemic shallowing, of course, that come, but this wrestling is nevertheless happening. This listening is happening, right? So I do think that the volume really speaks to this broader global turn where scholars across various fields are listening to the body. We're trying to listen and valorize experience, right? Human experience. And I think this sort of trying to embrace ideas around humanization in a time where dehumanization, I think, has become so quotidian. So I have hope that this will continue to happen. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are a few of my thoughts.
Thank you. Vinod, very briefly, did you want to make any comments? I mean, you don't have to, but if you want.
Just very, very briefly. I mean, there is, of course, a lot of disciplinary gatekeeping in all disciplines. I mean, I come from a field, communication, which is not even a discipline. I mean, it's quite an indisciplined field, very eclectic. It borrows from everything, I mean, but still wants to assert its own uniqueness, wants to talk about its own methodological domain. And so development studies in that sense has become this sort of mega enterprise. Unlike most other academic disciplines, development studies comes with a much more of very consequential baggage, there's a lot riding on development studies, and therefore the gatekeeping is even more intense. And I'm hopeful that books like this can at least start trying to make a dent in that gatekeeping process.
Thank you. David, you have the last word.
Gosh, I was just making notes on all of these really important points. I mean, I think, yes, ill-disciplined fields, I think is a nice concept. The idea of development studies, yes, as as carrying heavy consequential baggage. I mean, I think from a positioning in the UK, I mean, there's obviously the whole, colonial history of, of development studies and its applied tensions. And now, there's also, working in a UK university, it's really clear that, development studies is also part of the UK's post-Brexit export to the world. The packaging of, usable development studies knowledge and the business of attracting international students to study a subject that they are being encouraged to see as the key to jobs in the international consultancy world, or in government, or in an NGO development world. These are really pressing contemporary themes, and the field keeps changing. So if we have in some small way spoken to this field of development studies and challenge some of these tendencies, then I would be very, very happy. And it's been really a wonderful experience to engage with everybody here this afternoon, because I've really learned a lot from sort of taking this out. I mean, the problem with work like this is also that it exists in its own space. So, I mean, many of my, development studies colleagues would not think this is an interesting direction to take one's work, So, in that sense, it's a countercultural push, but it's one that I find much more interesting and exciting than the mainstream. So. And thank you for validating that feeling.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. This has been fascinating, and we've gone way above time, which is testimony to how much we've all enjoyed, but also how important this discussion has been. I have said I do these events regularly every 1 or 2 weeks, and I always end with saying that, for all the human and economic costs across the world of COVID, the one thing that came out of it is that we've all become more tech savvy, and we've learned to do things like Zoom meetings and Zoom calls and conferences, these kinds of meetings. Thank you very much. And in spite of the point that I did push rather bluntly about intellectual and disciplinary gatekeeping, I do want to end by saying that you must know, all of you, that it is because of the generosity with which all of you give your time and your expertise that we are able to have events like this, which we all think are very meaningful, and hope that these conversations will continue. But with that, David Lewis, my own colleague, to you very much so, and to Vinod Pavarala in Hyderabad, to Sarah Sadler and Krishnendu Ray in New York, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.